This book is capital E epic in terms of its historical scope, the amount of character, and the density of ideas that it explores, all the while maintaining a super personal and subjective point of view. She interrogates the history of a nation through the viewpoint of a single woman and her family. Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Honorée Fanonne Jeffers' new novel, The Love Songs of W.E.B Du Bois, which was published just a few months ago back in August. And I really struggled to write this review. There's just so much to be said about this novel. It's absolutely incredible. This book is epic in all the right ways. It's brilliantly smart, beautifully written, and just so engrossing. And it so effectively explores so many different issues, from race and racism to gender, sexism, colonialism, colorism, class, nationalism, the self, memory, America. I think most effectively, or most kind of grandly, it explores America as both a nation and an idea in a way that I don't think has really been done on a scale like this in quite a few years. And it brings the history of marginalized people, most especially in this book, women of color, to the center of this history rather than just kind of being left in the margins as most histories and historical epics do. This book is unapologetically a black feminist text, as the archival coda at the end of the book articulates. But importantly, it's very intersectional. It's not just interested in race or just interested in gender, of course. It's interested in the intersections between these and all those other things that I mentioned earlier, like class and regionalism and stuff like that, and how these all intersect throughout American history. So I will try to be as spoiler-free and as brief as possible, as I think that I just need to accept that I can't and probably shouldn't try to touch on everything that this book does. At the very core of this book, though, I think is an exegesis on the philosophical ideas and learned intellectual tradition of W.E.B Du Bois. Most especially, perhaps, is his idea of double consciousness, but that's only one of the very many ideas of Du Bois's that this book explores. This isn't to say that Jeffers' work is in any way subordinate to Du Bois's, though, but that Jeffers effectively analyzes the theories and ideas that Du Bois posited, and she responds, critiques, and extends his ideas. She effectively translates, in many ways, Du Bois to the 21st century. And I'll come back to Du Bois in just a little bit, but I suppose I should probably start by summarizing a little bit of how this book is structured and what it's really about. This book is a multi-generational epic spanning from antebellum 19th century America to the modern day, pretty much early 21st century. It focuses on a specific family living in the fictional town of Chickasetta, Georgia. And the narrative isn't linear like it is in so many generational epics. Instead, it jumps back and forth from the present to the past as we keep kind of getting sucked into the past. I like generational epics that are linear, books like The Eighth Life, for instance. I like them a lot, but I like when they play with the structure a lot more. And in Jeffers' work, she effectively moves back and forth between past and present, which I think more effectively connects the past to the present. But the majority of the love songs is focused on more or less the present day. It focuses on a character named Ailey Garfield, who was born in the early 70s, and we watch her grow up throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And her family moves between this very rural town of Chickasetta, Georgia, to a city in the north, probably Atlanta, though it's never really exactly clear what city this is. It's just a city up north. There is this recurring tension between rural life and city life. Much of this book, though, is a Bildungsroman for Ailey Garfield, but we keep getting sucked into the past as she learns more and more about her family, the town that she lives in, and, well, the history of this country. The history of her family goes back to her African and Creek ancestors, which is quite interesting, again, because it adds in a layer of intersectionality as it explores the colonialism and imperialism of indigenous people. And it connects the colonialism of indigenous people to the slave trade as African people are brought to America. And both of these groups, Africans and indigenous peoples, are both victimized by white people, mainly white men. And this is of course what happens, but this link to the Creek people emphasized her family roots to the land, And throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the slow creeping colonization of this land until 1805 and the Treaty of Washington, when the land that was formerly occupied and owned by the Creek Nation becomes Georgia, becomes what it is today. And interspersed between these temporal jumps are these love songs, which are just beautiful, basically prose poems that explore so many of these issues that this book is interested in. And let me actually just read the openings to one that I found particularly compelling. And I'll just read the first few paragraphs of this, but it's called The Loss of Africa. We know of those taken from the place called Africa, captured by men who had transgressed against flesh for a long time, the Africans who stole others and sold those to the Europeans, who would take them over the water and humiliate and sometimes torture them for life. We know about the dark, dark folks who never would see home again. We know dates. We know hours. We know disbelief. We know mourning. We know about the years even before 1619 and the years that would come after. We know about those Africans who arrived in a place that the English called Jamestown, Virginia. We know which villages these Africans lived in before they were stolen, their collection of conical, huddled homes, domestic birds running on the grounds of a courtyard, feathers of black and red, a goat tied to the side of a hut, and every morning a mother rising from her pallet, tossing grains in a pestle. We try not to weep over what we know was lost to these folks. And it goes on, and there are a ton of these, and again, they're just very, very poetic. But I hope you can see how a lot of these love songs take on a more communal voice, right? They're written in the first person plural. But by doing this, they're not only exploring the importance of community and of communal knowledge, kind of communal culture, but it also explores the importance of historical knowledge, right? Of understanding, of questioning, and of analyzing history, which obviously this book is really interested in doing. This idea of interrogating the archive is super important for this book and for the characters within this book as well. As Ailey digs through the family and town archives, her ancestors communicate with her through written documentation, the written record. But of course, much of their voice is erased, and Ailey really needs to probe and read between the lines in order to hear her ancestors, just as any historian of marginalized or oppressed people need to do. If there's any quest in this book, it's Ailey's search for her own family roots. And speaking of roots, one of the most interesting and one of my personal favorite characters in this book is Ailey's kind of great uncle, Uncle Root. Uncle Root is not only very funny and generous and kind, he's the kind of grandfather that we all want, but he's also a storyteller. He's a griot. He's a historian. He is actually a retired history professor from the local university that Ailey later attends. So much of Ailey's formative education comes by way of Uncle Root and her process of self-realization, and especially her analysis of a lot of W.E.B Du Bois's ideas, especially the idea of double consciousness, really has its roots in Uncle Root. He is the family griot, the family storyteller, at least for now. He was born in the early 20th century, so he knows many of his family members who were born in the antebellum period. So he has this real link to the past. And through him and through the archives, Ailey is able to go on this process of self-realization as she tries to figure out her own identity as a young woman of color. And of course, his name, Uncle Root, or at least that's his nickname, is Root. And Ailey, learns about her family roots and the country's roots from him. But I do also think that there might be a nod to Alex Haley's monumental book, Roots, the Saga of an American Family, as both the love songs of W.E.B Du Bois and Roots, the Saga of an American Family, in very different ways, but they both, in their sort of historical fiction, do a very similar kind of probing. But so Uncle Root is this griot figure in Ailey's life, and he embodies so many of the ideas of W.E.B Du Bois specifically, as Du Bois is Uncle Root's favorite thinker, and Uncle Root has this great story of how he met Du Bois one time. But I do want to talk a bit about Du Bois, because not only is this book interspersed with all of these love songs, which are, by the way, kind of structurally very similar to the songs that begin each chapter in Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. But alongside these love songs, there are all of these direct quotations from the writings of Du Bois. And further, within the chapter, the characters are often explicitly, occasionally implicitly, but very often explicitly debating the philosophies of Du Bois. There's an ongoing conversation between two characters of who was the better thinker, Booker T. Washington or Du Bois. But I don't think it'd be too controversial to suggest that W.E.B. Du Bois is the most popular and influential African-American thinker from the first half of the 20th century. He was an intellectual and a scholar. He was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard. It'd be difficult to overstate his influence. And obviously, his influence on Jeffers is monumental, hence the name of the book. Throughout this book, there are, as I said, all of these snippets from Du Bois's writing, directly quoting him, and many of them come from his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, which contain various essays. But one of Du Bois's most famous and influential ideas is his idea of double consciousness, which he explores and articulates in the first essay in that volume. And this idea of double consciousness, I think, is fundamental to this book. So the language is a bit dated, so let's just listen to a quick extract from the chapter of Our Spiritual Strivings from The Souls of Black Folk.
After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face.
And Ailey struggles with this notion a lot. As she goes to some majority white schools, she does go to some majority black schools as well, but in all of these circumstances, she needs to be, as Du Bois posits, she needs to be hyper aware of her own identity as a black woman. She needs to be aware of her own blackness. And much of this novel is Ailey navigating this messy and at times dangerous world in which she needs to maintain this double consciousness. But of course, Jeffers goes beyond Du Bois. You probably noticed the default masculine in Du Bois's words. Ailey is not only an African American, but she's a woman. Even the great Du Bois needs to be revised and expanded upon. And Ailey's desire to not only come into herself as a person of color, but as an independent woman is a difficult process, as the characters that both she and her ancestors encounter try to get in the way in some way or another, and try to get in her way is putting it rather lightly, as there is just so much personal trauma and just awful things that happen to these characters by just awful people. But that being said, all of the characters in this novel are super well-rounded, even the almost downright evil ones. So this book is just brilliant on so many levels. You can really tell while reading it that Jeffers was and is a poet before she was a novelist. The sentence level writing of this book is just gorgeous. This book is also a very regional book, as it is highly focused on this fictional town of Chickasetta, Georgia. But like William Faulkner's recurring fictional town, or county of Yapanapatofa County in his books, or like Jesmyn Ward's fictional town of Bois Sauvage in all of her books, Jeffers uses Chickasetta, Georgia, again, very similarly to Faulkner and Ward, both as a hyper-specific place, but also as a way to get at, in miniature, the more universal America. That is, this book remains regional and specific, but it expands this specificity to engulf the rest of the nation. And indeed, speaking of Jesmyn Ward, I think there are actually many productive comparisons to be made between Jesmyn Ward's work and Jeffers', as not only do both writers wield an intensely lyrical pen, but both authors in their works have an unflinching exploration of personal trauma, cultural trauma, as well as just interrogating modern discussions of race and gender, and all of this while really interrogating the history of this country. I really dislike the conversation around the question, what is the American epic? As it's often reductive, but in my opinion, this is about as close to an American epic as we've gotten in the past few years. This book is capital E epic in terms of its historical scope, the amount of character, and the density of ideas that it explores, all the while maintaining a super personal and subjective point of view. She interrogates the history of a nation through the viewpoint of a single woman and her family. I really can't recommend it enough. Let me know if you read the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I think we'll be discussing this novel for years to come, so I'd be really interested to hear what you think about it. But for now, thanks for watching.